I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Just made the face at me again. That was like you're gonna start laughing.
No, welcome to Arcane Mark AMA, although it looks like the camera decided it thought this was funny and sort of blurred it all out. Today we are going to answer everybody's questions from chat, unless they're questions that we are not allowed to answer, in which case we will not answer them. So, chat, ask any questions. And in fact, before we started, chat was asking some other random news-based questions that won't matter to you when you're watching this on YouTube. So now we're going to see what questions are coming in during the episode. They might be as hilarious as the questions from before the episode
Yes,
were.
I was wiping my eyes because I was having a giggle fit.
We were talking about the possible alignment of the cloud bot that is like not working very well, and Linda said that there are no evil cloud bots in the remaster, and I said fine, it can be sanctified unholy. Alright, so Numbat wonders, do we miss anything about living in the Seattle area? Well, you know, I feel like the temperature range in the Seattle area I like better than in Maryland. Maryland gets a little hotter during the summer, and that can be annoying.
When we were like still in the office and hanging out with folks, you know, it was cool to see them. But I would say that being here and being near family and being in the same time zone as family is totally worth.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a question from Shamwolf about having issues with NDAs given that we work for two different companies. Definitely sometimes I'm like watching and waiting for when I know that Mark has been told a thing, and then I'm like, the day that I heard that like, you know, Roll for Combat has been told about this thing and Mark knows about the thing, it's like, so, did you hear anything interesting today?
Also, sometimes, like, if the partners are told about something early, then Linda will be like, what? You just found out about that thing? I didn't even know that people knew. It's like, yeah, all the partners just heard.
Yeah, it's like Mark had mentioned something to me that's a Paizo thing, because obviously I would have known already.
Yep.
So, I think it's usually more of like a wait until they know.
From my side, since Linda is like sort of also on some of the Roll for Combat NDAs, like usually it's okay, and Steven will say it's okay to tell her some things and not other things.
Mm-hmm.
The hardest NDA thing was not between Linda and me. It was between me, myself, and I. Because there was a point in time where I knew, but was under NDA not to tell Steven, that Paizo was doing Rage of Elements. And I knew, but was an NDA not to tell Paizo, that Steven was doing Eldamon. And that Steven was doing a element-based RPG Superstar that he wanted to do, which he was going to call, like, Wrath of the Elements.
And so you had to be like,
I couldn't
Wrath
violate
of the
my
Elements.
NDA. I was just like, I don't really like Wrath of the Elements. You know, Wrath of the Righteous already exists and is very similar. Could we do something else? I get why you want them to be based on different elements. I think that's a good theme, but like, could we call it Elemental Storm? Like some other thing that's not like Wrath of the Elements or Anger of. He was like, what about Anger of the Elements? Maybe something else.
It's like I can't. You're like you couldn't tell him
why. I couldn't tell him why or say that there was another thing. I was just like, I didn't like that name. I was like, I just don't think it's as good of a name. And he actually never suggested Rage of the Elements, which I actually think is the best anger word of elements name that you can have, personally. But like, just literally, I knew everything and could not tell anyone about either of those things. But all I could do was be like, I was like at one point, you know, I wasn't even working, all the way.
Disappointment of the Elements.
Yeah, that's not as good. Mild Disappointment of the Elements. But I wasn't even all the way working for Battle Zoo. At one point, I was like, Steven, I know as a partner, you know, who's like a paid partner of Paizo on RPG Superstar and other things that you get like in advance information about what the books are. Can you tell me which ones you know? And he was like, oh yeah, I know a lot. I know more than people know. And he would read off names that he knew, because, you know, I was at Paizo, so I, of course, knew all of them. And he stopped, literally exactly before Rage of Elements. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you do know a couple that nobody else knows. Mm-hmm. That's really good. I was like, okay.
Oh my god.
And Steven's like, yeah, you know, we have partner things. I talk to people a lot from Paizo, and I was like, okay, yeah, and he was just like talking about the things he wanted to do with the elements. I was like, maybe you should tell that to some of the people that that you're talking to, because some of the people he talked to like have way more authority than me to say things, right?
So you were hoping to steer him into mentioning that to Eric Mona, so Eric Mona could make an executive decision to reveal so that they didn't collide. Yeah,
absolutely. I was doing everything I could while being under 2 different NDAs to try to like get someone to tell someone that there were things that were pretty similar to each other. But ultimately, I think they support each other. Yeah, I don't think there's literally any problem, and in fact, it's better to have both of them, but I also thought it was something that both of them would want to know that they were doing. Yeah. This actual strong synergy release, rather than do it by accident and both sides maybe thinking like what's going on. So I think that's been much bigger than anything that's been between like Linda and me personally. So let's see, what other questions have
There's a question about who was the lead on the kineticist.
As far as I know, that the entire design team was, and if you like, because it was gigantic, right? It was by far the biggest class that has come out. That's part of why it has so much flavor and so many options. It's just it literally has the space to. Whereas other times when we were like, how much can we fit in some of these other classes, and the answer was, even to get what was there, we had to cut pages from other things that were in the book out of the book to make them fit. To fit to a signature, but Kineticist was so big, having one person write all of that would be pretty tough. Which, working on the Eldamon trainer class and those that has, oh my goodness, over 100 pages, 160 pages worth of content.
There's a reason that many work weeks are dedicated to that.
And that I spent months on. Yes, you can't have one person do that unless, like, you're doing some weird thing, like, for combat. So they split it up, and that's why I heard different designers being like, oh yeah, I did most of this powers, or not powers, the impulses.
Yeah. So,
it was, all of the classes go through iterations where each person looks at it. That's true for any of them, even if you say, well, Mark led on the summoner, but other people looked at the summoner, right? Or Mike led on the gunslinger, but other people looked at the gunslinger. But it is true that the one person did a ton of the initial concepting. And for Kineticist, what they said is the whole team actually created separate versions secretly and then did a big reveal and then like spliced them together or something like that. That's what they've said. So
yeah, there was a question about if that was Avi. Avi is our lead editor. They are fantastic and they have worked on so many different projects.
That's true. If who was Avi?
The lead design on Kineticist.
Yeah, it was definitely not Avi, in that Avi is an amazing editor, but is also not a designer, and so therefore would be the lead editor on a lot of things, but and is like the lead editor of the line, but would not be the lead designer on anything. Could be an author as well. So then I saw another question was saying, with the success of Kineticist, do you think that'd be possible to see other attrition-less casters? Well, I think so. I've been working on the Eldamon trainer and Elemental Avatar, which are both kind of attrition-less casters. They're not exactly attrition-less casters, but they pretty much are. And I've been working on them before Kineticist was revealed out. And they're very, very different than Kineticist. In fact, given that they both allow you to use some number of elements worth of things and don't have attrition and are pseudo casters but don't use spells, which like already that, like Kineticist is kind of similar to the Elementalist spellcaster archetype, although one has spell slots and one doesn't, etc., etc. But they're drastically different in how they work, because Kineticist is like spend your feet, learn the thing, use it as many times as you want, and spam the one that's right for this move. Whatever's good for your situation and rotation. And it's got like, it's very action hungry. It wants to do these amazing action combinations with one action and then your two actions, and put all your feats in there, all your actions in there, do things with action economy and wild combos. I really like Kinesis for that reason, because I like doing ridiculous combos that require lots of system mastery to come up with ridiculous things. With Eldamon Trainer and Elemental Avatar, it's both simpler than that, and it's very different because it's rotational. So you cannot spam. Once you've used one of your powers, you can't use it again until you use a refresh power, which tends to be a little bit more passive or less likely to do a big bang on your enemies to get your powers back.
You're going to be strategizing about like, okay, you know, when do I want to use this one? When do I want to use this one? And when do I want to cycle back around?
And you don't typically spend your feats for powers. You just get them. But you have to choose a lineup that you know you want to use all of them, more or less. And some of them are reactions, but the other ones are 2 action. Because there aren't ones that are 1 action, very specifically. Because the 2 action ones are very... some of them are 3, if they like make a wall or something. But they're big, and we know that how long it takes you to have to rotate through by doing your refresh power if you use them every time. And they're very damaging and powerful. They're probably more powerful than you'll see from a direct damage big hit from an impulse. They're more like a top level spell. If you're not like a psychic or some class that gets big spell damage boost. But you can't do it again until you refresh. So if there's one that's the exact one that you need for some reason, which this is a bad idea, but it's like, oh, I prepared all bad ones somehow except for one. I'll cast that one, but then I have to refresh, and you wind up only doing it every other turn, which that'll never happen to you in a real combat, but usually. But if it did, you could see how, like, suddenly only doing it not every turn actually is a significant limitation to you in a way that you might say, wait, though, but if it's close to a top-level slot, you don't get that many of them per day. But even, like, a druid or someone who doesn't have extra, like a wizard or sorcerer can cast... They don't get that many per day, but they could cast them all in a row if they wanted to. So it's got a lot of interesting differences, and it is attritionless over the course of the long term. Other than at level 19 ultimate ability that takes an hour to get back, but okay, fine. You won't have your one level 19 ultimate button once you've hit the ultimate button.
So there's
for 18 levels. And
then that's kind of like the mirror of like the 10th level spells of just this absurd thing that you can sometimes do. I see a question here about favorite house rules for PF2.
I mean, I like the alternate rules that I put into the Game Mastery Guide.
I was starting to think, like, have we done anything that's purely house rules? I'm only thinking of using different alternate rules. Like, we've done some things with... We've done some things with free archetype. I really enjoyed what we started to do with monster parts as well in some of our campaigns.
Yeah, I enjoy alternate roles, and, like, I always want as many of them as possible. I'm glad we got as many as we did into the Game Mastery Guide, and hopefully there's a place for more of them after the remaster. I saw that GM Core actually seems to have fewer pages of it than Game Mastery Guide, but you know, they'll always be on Netflix and in the Game Mastery Guide either way.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is that some of the areas that our home group was much more likely to house rule around are things that wound up being different in PF2. Like, for example, our home group had some house rules around, like, making it harder for your characters to get killed in PF1.
And now unconscious. It's harder to die in PF2, because in PF1 you basically died automatically at higher levels if you got KO'd.
Or making it so that like crafting was going to have less of a impact on boosting your overall like party.
So it wouldn't double your wealth.
So it wouldn't double your wealth, but then it doesn't do that
because it takes a
PF2.
significant number of days to get it. It can double your wealth, but by that time you could have also doubled your wealth from earning income because the GM just let you earn income for years or something like that.
So those are some of the main areas that we tweaked. We also had a thing that was We also had kind of like a pseudo rarity type thing going on with some of our stuff that we would do, so that you could be like harder to find things that were uncommon and having commonality things. So I would say like when I think of our house rules,
I introduced that to our group, and our other GMs really liked it because it allowed for a toggle of control and for not an assumption that if Paizo printed it anywhere, even like a player companion or the back of an AP, and was like, this is a rare spell that Karzu the Claimer created and nobody knows, that it wouldn't suddenly be available to everybody in the setting instantly.
Yeah, in that case, like, because we didn't have the more fine-tuned tools, we generally were like, okay, it's kind of by the source book, so, like, the core rulebook stuff is probably going to be available. Like, if your class came directly out of a later book and you're playing that class, like, the spells that were directly on their list are probably going to be generally available, but, like, stuff that's in like the back of an AP or like a player companion or some other book, like probably we're going to take a closer look at it and say, because we like the idea of being able to have some things that were like special rewards that you would seek out.
Yeah, so I mean, things that were my homebrew rules in PF1 are sometimes things that I help put into PF2. So yeah. That's how it goes when you co-created the game. But still, like, you know, small house rules that aren't even worth being like this is a big thing, but are just like oh yeah, we saw this one thing and it looked like it was like miswritten a little bit, and we house ruled it slightly. Like, our group does that all the time. Even for things I think are fine, having co-created the game, our GM is sometimes like, no, I still think needs a little tweaking.
And then it's like,
so that's what we do.
We talk things out as a group when one of us thinks that something.
And if the group decides as a whole that that's what we want to do, then that's what we do.
And we have a general understanding that, like, you know, if the GM is eventually like, yeah, you know what, that seems a little strong, or I don't quite like how that works, then they can talk with the player, and if the player's like, yeah, well, maybe I'm not as interested in that option anymore, and then the GM's like, they can try to work out a version the player is still interested in, or like, then the player can train that out for a different option. So we're pretty flexible that way. I see a question from Turgman.
Yeah, what is the best and sneakiest way to reword stuff to save word count when you have to cut down? So I want to clarify that. There are particular ways to save word count, but you only typically need to do those if you're writing to like a test or a like a prompt to like the RPG Superstar contest prompt where they're like, we dogmatically want this exact number of words. What's actually more useful is, I think, in my daily work, is tips to cut down lines when copy fitting, which is not the same as saving word count, because some of the things that I could tell you that would save word count don't save you, like, any space, and will not actually help you fit when things need to be cut down. So those are two different questions of what my top tips are.
So can I answer the cut down part from my perspective then?
Yes.
The best way to cut things down is to find a way to represent what you're doing with systems that already exist. So, like, if you have, like, a complicated subsystem that takes a lot of explanation, and then you can, like, turn it into, like, an existing GMG subsystem or, like, a slight variant, and then be like, yeah, use this GMG subsystem, and here's, like, a small thing that's going on to it, then you can save yourself the space for explaining things. Similarly, if you have a creature that you're presenting, and it's like, okay, you know, it's as this creature, except it has I don't know, it has like claws that it attacks with instead of jaws or whatever. Then you can, or it has like as this creature, but it has this one special ability. Then sometimes you can save a lot of space by being like this, and then also that one ability, and not reprinting everything.
You can tell that Linda works with adventures because these tips are presupposing that you're in an adventure more or less, and they are excellent tips. You should try to do those even if you don't need to save the words, unless you need to specifically spin wheels and spend words.
I would say, like, if you're doing something that's, well, I figure it makes more sense for me to speak to the adventure part because that's what I have more experience with. I would say consider how valuable the descriptive text that you have is as well.
But also don't assume that it's the thing of lowest value, because some people do and they make a mistake.
Yeah, but like sometimes you'll find, for example, that if you're saying something over and over again, you could just put it like up at the top. Like you don't need to say, you know, that moisture is dripping from the cavernous walls of every room and that every room is dark. you know, and then you describe about how every room is dark and dank, and then you get to the one room that has light. You can say, like, up at the beginning, you know, the chambers of this cavern are dark and dank, you know, and there's no light sources unless otherwise noted or whatever. So sometimes you can do things where you gather together information at the beginning, because presenting information in a good order helps you not have to repeat yourself a lot or not have to, like, spend extra words on explaining things. I would say that when it comes to, like, rules text, and then I find that it's more like which of these elements are bearing the most weight for you in terms of cutting it. Is that what you find in your experience, where it's like, well, you know, rather than necessarily trying to nickel and dime everything out of, like, each little piece?
It's very dangerous if you cut some of the words from rules text, because you can wind up changing what it means. But I would say that it completely depends on what you need. So first, I would say make something that's vaguely an estimate and then try to lay it out. Now, how much are you over? How much are you over? If you're over by, like, an amount that, like, causes eldritch abominations to appear on your screen, and it just is so much, then find entire, like, sections to just cut. Even if that means that you need to, if you're like, well, the smallest section I could cut is still a little bit more than the amount that I'm over, that's fine. You can expand one of the things that's still in there. It's way easier than going in and doing small cuts on everything, and it can screw up your spreads. So find the minimum number of sections that you can cut that will do it if it's over by that much. Now, let's say it's not. Let's say it's over by a lot, but not by, like, even close to an entire section or category. Then, if it's rules text and it's a bunch of, like, magic items or spells or something like that, cut entire magic items or spells first. Let's say you can't. Let's say you are at, like, one of, like, you're at the level 25 tree raiser difficulty task of copy fitting, which was when I had to copy fit the spells chapter for the core rulebook of Pathfinder 2. Which I could cut a spell, I guess, but then that spell doesn't exist in the core of Pathfinder 2, and maybe one that everybody wants to exist or that is important for some reason, or like the wizard class is like, but then we won't have a spell of that school at that spell level. So it's very difficult to cut any of the spells from the core rulebook without really causing harm. In that case, what you want to do, hopefully in that case you have a very gigantic section, which the core rulebook spell chapter was. Then you do have to nickel and dime. Yeah. So in that case, go to every section first and see if you can get one line from them, especially ones that are, like, not all the way to the end of their last line.
So you just have, like, a few words there. Also, take a look at sections that have, like, that are wrapping around, like, a piece of art or something like that in a layout, because those are really likely to be like, oh, if I just get rid of this one large word here, suddenly it chunks up a few lines. The way that things fit.
Yes, potentially what you want to do if you're trying to make things fit better is that you want to actually have it so that the art, if it's eating into two columns, is up against things that already had line returns, so that they were going to take the whole line either way, rather than up against running text that you can't fit that much into that space, for one thing. But, like, let's say if you have 110 spells and you cut one line from each of them, then that saves, like, a page. And that saves an entire page that's over. So
you can also consider when you have things that are constrained by the alphabet, giving something a new name so that it fits better. If you're like, okay, yeah, you know, I can't fit this. Like, I've got these spells, and, like, I can't fit all of them here because, like, this one has really long ones, and here's a short one. It's like, could I possibly rename this thing? Although, when you do renaming, make sure you do a search through and find every instance where that's referenced.
Also,
so you don't
keep in mind that copy fitting the way I did in the spells chapter is very time intensive. So there was just a stretch of time where it was just like, how much time can we afford to leave Mark in the spells section? Because for every week that we do, we'll get a few pages back that can mean that we don't have to cut the magic item section or certain other places that we're gonna have to get cut. And we, management optimized what they thought that was, which was me copy fitting everything from like A through G roughly. So you'll also find that the spells from A through G are a little more pithy than the spells after G because of the fact that they've often lost like a little bit of things so that they would fit more.
Another consideration when fitting text is always go from beginning to end. Because if you are not being thorough in the beginning and then you pick up something in the middle, and you go through to the middle.
You also probably want to not end like in a really nasty place where like the name of a spell is at the bottom line and then all of its things are on the next page.
So like if you're doing major cuts, absolutely it makes sense to go through and do all the major cuts first. But when you're doing ticky tack stuff, like if you do stuff in the middle before you do stuff at the beginning, you'll waste your time because like then you'll pull back one line and then suddenly all of your stuff is borked and then you may find that a different thing worked better.
Correct.
So yeah,
100%.
always beginning to end.
100%. So the next question is how much world building should you do before starting a homebrew game? So my answer to that is to follow the first rule of Dungeon Craft by Ray Winnegar, which is never create something that you don't have to unless you really want to because you enjoy it. So create what you need to create in order to start. What do you need? You probably need a place for the players to go. You maybe need enough context that they can make some decisions and that you understand what's going on.
You need a sense of like basic geography and religion. You need a sense of what's the general level of like magic and technology that the PCs can expect to run across? What like classes and ancestries and things are generally going to be available? What are like some of the common beliefs that people have, and like how are the PCs going to be received by the people that they come across?
Yep.
And then beyond that, it's more a matter of what organizations and groups and things do you need to build out the stories of the characters. So like, maybe you don't necessarily, you're starting in a more central location on a continent, so you don't necessarily care as much about what's going out on the coast, except for, one of your PCs is coming in and they want to be from a coastal fishing village, so you can figure out like a little bit about the town they came from, but you don't necessarily know like everything along that coast. And you can engage your players in the process of building things out.
So TC Moonpie is wondering how you engage your players into sort of the life as normal in your world when there's a world-ending plot that's going to happen later on in the campaign. What are some tips for doing that? So what I would say is if you start with more of like Monster of the Week type or smaller scale problems that can be completed, and then you're like, but I did complete it. Maybe there are hints that something's going on. Like they mentioned in the question, there were some hints that were going on in there. So you can do that, but make sure that they also get a chance after these, if you want to establish what's normal, to hang out, do some slice of life stuff, start that tavern they wanted to run, do some other things, build up roots, have some downtime. Rather than making all of the starting things also be on a timer, because that lets them get a sense of normalcy that can be thrown off when the world is on an apocalypse.
And I think about like the arcs of a lot of TV shows where they start more episodic and then they have more and more meta plot as they go along, because initially it's more like, yes, we're doing this, and then they discover something major that they're latching onto. Like you'll see that a lot in TTRPGs too, where the players have decided that's the direction that they're interested in, or that's the major threat that they're dealing with. And so they're going to be spending less time saying, yes, I'm going to go to this town and do this thing here, than they did in the beginning. And I would say like you were saying about the timer, also like the sense of like tension, even if you are ultimately going to introduce like big threats, you don't necessarily want to, it depends on your story, right? It can be dramatic to start off, and it's like, yes, there's this attack, and then that introduces the big villain, right? But then you want to move to a place where the scale is smaller, the scope is smaller, and that it's not like oh my gosh, we're up against something that's hopeless and we're not going to be able to do anything useful until we level up 10 times. It's okay, yeah, we found that. That's our long-term goal. But right now, how can we be heroes in this moment? How can we make a difference in the world around us?
Absolutely. So Rico is wondering, why do we play and run Theater of the Mind? Rico used to, but stopped for a few reasons, and is curious. So just honestly, it's easiest for our group because of the fact that we can go through things kind of more quickly. If we had to have all of our players on the virtual tabletop, the GM would take much longer to prep, and then we'd have to poke some of the players to get things loaded on and to move their things on the virtual tabletop, and combats would take 5 times as long.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because our group is good at figuring out geometrically where things are in Theater of the Mind compared to I think the average group that is not made up of our group's composition is such that I believe that I still do believe that having the PhD from MIT is not the median, because merely 3 of the people in our group have that.
Yeah.
So the median is just somewhere in the master's range.
Most of us met at MIT. So,
and a lot of them are quantum physicists.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying every group can easily do the geometry of a tabletop game, but our group generally can. But getting them to go and do all of the things on a VTT is just a pain.
Personally, although I majored in math, spatial reasoning has always been the hardest for me. So when it comes to the games, one thing that I value, one thing that we do is that we may not necessarily be okay, we're putting out everything on the VTT, but when we're doing things, but we can send each other, here's the map of the area. You've scattered it out, or you have it, or it's not too whatever. So we may not be moving our minis on that map, but we can still see, okay, here's the map, we're in area D4 right now. And then when I'm going through, then for example, in a recent one, it's okay, here's the map of the place you're in. And then the GM, describes some of the areas. And then I might, because I tend to be our group's note taker.
Rohit's also a quantum physicist. There you go.
Best of luck with your thesis.
My fun story about that is that since we had 3 physicists in our group, somebody asked me on my, Ask Mark Seifter questions thing about, for an air elemental in Pathfinder 1st edition, since it didn't say exactly what the size of the funnel is based on the size of the elemental, what would be the appropriate size scientifically based on the volume of the elemental. So I asked my 3 at the time PhD candidates, they were right close towards defending their theses at that point in time, and their answer to me was, Mark, that's a fluid dynamics question. We're quantum physicists. We don't know how to solve this question.
That was great.
So,
but yes. To be fair, you working in AI, when everyone's well, computer science.
No,
you should be able to fix my laptop.
It's a completely reasonable answer. It's just a funny answer.
But one of the things that I would do as well with some of the Theater of the Mind stuff is draw myself, because I don't need the full dimensions of everything. But sometimes what I'll do is I'll draw myself little ball and stick maps, and whether that's for me or for my players, I like to share that with them as well. And it's just all right, here's this room, and then that room connects to this room, and things like that, and then they have labels based on what room you're in. So yeah, that's enough to get the sense of how do the spaces connect with each other and how do they flow. And then if you do have a combat that's getting more complicated, then putting out a map for just that room. Or sometimes even, because my group does tend toward Theater of the Mind, when I'm running for them and the room gets more complicated, I might just have a little map that I'm using on my own that's, not pretty at all, but it still, gets the job done in terms of making sure that I can still visualize where everything is. And when I'm running for folks other than my home group, I do use maps, in PFS and stuff like that. I will just usually take out the battle map and draw something in or whatever, or I've done some things on Roll20 and stuff like that. So I think that I'm one of the people in the group who sometimes struggles with that a little bit more, but like strategies like ball and stick and stuff like that help. And I do find that with Theater of the Mind, I'm like compared to not Theater of the Mind, because sort of the assumption of Theater of the Mind is that you round in the player's favor. You don't have those situations where it's like, oh darn, like I thought I could make it there, but I was exactly 5 feet too short. Like that kind of stuff doesn't happen nearly as often, because you say like, all right, you started the combat and like the front line is 20 feet away from, is 20 feet away from the first enemy, and then the next enemy is 10 feet behind that, and then like you guys all come in. And it's like, all right, so, these melees are engaging enemy 1 and these melees are engaging enemy 2. And so it's not so much like where exactly they are in the room. It's more like relative distance. These people are next. There's a clump over here and there's a clump over here.
You remember the vectors of distance between every major player and every other major player, essentially. And that can help you to be able to calculate things very easily without needing to necessarily commit to having the full 3-dimensional map.
And then I tend to choose distances between things that are convenient for me. So like I might be like, oh yeah, these two opponents are 10 feet apart, so then like that's easy for the players to get between fighting the two of them. Or, maybe it's like, oh yeah, these two opponents are 30 feet apart, and like, okay, that's going to take some more effort to...
And I also agree with Tela de Locadora, who says in Theater of the Mind, you feel like you're inside the game. Absolutely. I feel like when I use miniatures, I know it actually brings most people more into the game, but I am one of the very small minority, which Tela de Locadora is also in, where I feel like I'm the gods in Clash of the Titans, where like all those little game pieces are the heroes who are out there, and I am just like, it pulls me out of my character immediately, because I'm now looking on from them from above like they're a board game. Not because I think that playing with miniatures is a board game. It isn't. It clearly isn't.
But because it feels more like
But because it gets me in the mindset of being an omniscient deity who can see things from a bird's eye view instead of seeing it from my view. And that's why Tela de Locadora said a VR thing actually works well for people who... And I actually have not used a VR thing for that, but you're probably right that for people with my style of immersion, I would be immersed by VR in the same way that I am with Theater of the Mind, and I'm not for most VTTs or regular tabletops.
There's a great follow-up here. Do things like the difference between 25 feet of movement and 30 feet of movement get washed away in Theater of the Mind?
It depends on how vigorous your Theater of the Mind is.
Yeah, like for me, I tend to care about those more when I'm running on like the approach. Like, so... I can set a distance between the group such that, like...
Or we look on the map of the published adventure and be like, oh, well, I know that the person who opened the door is at this door, and I know the enemy is there. When we started the fight, and I counted it out, and it looks like it's actually, there's 6 empty squares in between, so no, 25 is not enough.
So I tend to take a look at that more at the beginning of the combat, and then once I'm in it, then like I have my approximation of where the clusters are, and I err on the player's favor, if I'm not like fully tracking it out myself.
That looks like TC Moonpie may also be part of that minority of players that is along with me. There we go. I didn't even think that we would have 3 out of 16 people who are here right now, counting us and all of chat. That would be that. I thought that our group of people was actually more unusual than that, and that it was really like 90% plus who get more immersed with the minis.
Rico mentions flanking. Yeah, I think flanking is definitely easier, because usually you're just like, unless the players like both just got to the enemy at the very end of their range of movement, you can be like, you can.
We've definitely had flanks not work a lot of times in Theater of the Mind, because we do keep track of the distances well enough to know whether it can apply, and we keep track of who's taking up the flank positions to know, like, for example, it's like, oh, you're there, and then you have 2 allies adjacent to you. So that means that you can...
You're not all flanking with each other now, but you can trade around.
You and your other 2 allies who are next to you mean that you can only be flanked by 1 pair of enemies. unless your allies randomly flanked you in a line, in which case you can be flanked by 2 pairs of enemies. But they probably didn't, unless they said that that's where they wanted to go.
So it'll be like, all right, the first one goes up, and then the second one probably goes into the
I even sometimes
yeah.
ask. I say, all right, so we see that the one person went up next to Linda's character.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go across from Linda's character, or do you want to be in one of the other positions next to her where you'll be preventing an additional flank?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, one reason why Rico is right is that assuming that they have enough movement speed, it's a lot easier when there's theater of the mind and someone's just like, I move up to the ogre. And you say, okay, cool. You have enough move to get a flank. Do you want a flank? And they'll say, yes, I do.
Whereas and then, I'm not picturing in my head, whether it's a north-south or east-west flank necessarily at that point. I'm just like, yeah, they had enough move. They're in one of the flanks.
I am.
Yeah.
And I remember which one it is so that I know whether they'll get hit by an AoE. The main thing that matters, and the reason why Rico's saying it's easier to get a flank, is because if it's on a VTT,
mm-hmm.
and let's just say that the person did say they were going into a flank here, right? But the GM, or even one of the other players, because it's a theater of the mind and we're trying to have our mental picture ask, hey, did you move into the flank?
Mm-hmm.
And they say yes. And in any group social contract, that's a reasonable question to ask, unless they
mm-hmm.
specifically say, I move up and I don't give the rogue the flank because I am a terrible person.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I can. I know I can.
And...
I just hate fun and teamwork. But unless they say that, of course it's within the social contract to say that. But
mm-hmm.
if you have a VTT and Jim, the player, goes up and just moves into a non-flank for no reason and has more than enough move to get a flank, and then they drop their thing there and all right, I'm going to make an attack. You now have to worry about the social contract of whether you'll be seen as a busybody or controlling player if you were like, hey, you had some extra move. Could you move into the flank with me? I'm a rogue, and
mm-hmm.
I have 4d6 sneak attack that I will get if you go there. And also the AC of the enemy will be too lower for you.
So you just kind of, I think you are able to picture things in more direct detail than I am when we're doing this thing. But either way, you can, Or tell us talking about with one stride you can do X, with 2 strides you can do Y if the players don't ask for anything specific. Exactly. And then just kind of assuming that within the realm of what they can do, if you can imagine a few different ways they could position themselves, that they're positioned in the best possible
way. That's why.
Or if it's ambiguous, then you ask one or the other. It's would you like to, and I would say that if there's something on the map that's particularly dangerous, then you definitely want to call attention to it. So if somebody's okay, I want to go up and attack this enemy, and then it's all right, well, they were standing near the edge of the lava pit, so if you take the flank position with your ally, you're going to be adjacent to the lava pit and might possibly get pushed in, but you will then get a flank. Do you want to take the flank position, or do you want to be farther from the lava pit?
It's all about questions from both sides. It also keeps players sometimes more engaged, because you kind of pay attention, you ask questions. If it's just on the VTT, they could be on their phone and then look and be oh, okay, yeah, attack. So you'll ask, can I get to the flank and then the GM says, ooh, yeah, but it'll take an additional stride because you don't quite have enough move. Or the thing with the lava pit. So it leads to a back and forth, and it works best if you can keep track of sort of certain positions on the board, and I totally get that not everybody can, and Theater of the Mind is not. If you want to be as rigorous as our group is, Theater of the Mind is not right for every group, because being able to do that much is something that not every group can.
Yeah.
And in that case, a virtual tabletop or a regular tabletop help a ton. But it also makes the prep so much lighter to not have to prep a virtual tabletop.
Mm-hmm. Which definitely does make things easier for it. Also, I find means that Theater of the Mind works better, in my opinion, for improvising and spontaneity. So, if you're partway through your session and you decide, hey, actually, these pieces that I had for later on in the story, I think I can fit these together in a better way, and have this encounter take place with this creature, and then add in one of these creatures, and then put it in this different setting. Whereas if I had prepared everything in advance and I prepared all my maps and it's oh gosh, well, now they're going to do an ambush in the inn, whereas I thought that they were going to be fighting in the mine, and then it's okay, well, now I don't have a map for that anymore. Whereas you can more easily just be yeah, that's the thing.
Yep. Absolutely.
I also
Much
think that
easier to
because
improvise.
Mark was my first GM and the one who taught me how to run games, that like that's a style that I now prefer. But I can also run with the maps too.
Yeah, I can too. I do for PFS also.
Yeah, you did the
like
maps
I
for
got
PFS.
I got 5 stars in PFS 1, all of which I ran. I did run with maps. I did not just run Theater of the Mind for people there because it was an expectation for PFS that I would, and so I did.
But even with like the maps, I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, and then I have like the minis that fit exactly with this, because I found personally that it was easier for me to keep track of things if the minis were more distinct from each other. So like for example, even if you have like the little stickers on them, if the PCs were fighting like bandits A through D and I had minis that looked really similar, I would get super confused. So like I would prefer to be like, all right, these are the bandits. And like then I would use one. It's like, okay, you know, she's got a giant red ponytail, and like he's got a sword.
That tiefling.
Yeah, and like he's got a sword and shield, and like, you know, he's wearing robes and things like that. So even if like the statistics are the same, I needed the anchor of the visual being different. Otherwise, I would easily lose track of which one was which.
So I had a different reason why I also did the same thing as Linda and used the wrong minis for things on purpose, which is back to my I don't like it to look enough like the real things or else I get drawn out of the game. If everything looks exactly like the monsters and the PCs, then I feel like that is those are the characters, and I even more feel like that god looking down. Whereas if it's just like a very low quality, just somebody drew marker on a whiteboard, it feels like maybe it's an abstraction and I'm just looking at a planned thing, and like it has the wrong minis. It may feel like I'm looking at an unrelated game board, and I get drawn out of the game less. Whereas if it's like high quality Dwarven Forge, and it's exactly the dungeon, you can see the Sahedrons that were painted on there and everything, that makes my brain even more be like, this is definitely, this thing there is the game.
And not this
Your
thing
mind's
here,
eye is not. You can't see it from first person. You're in a third person aerial because look how accurate it is. And then I get drawn out of my character more. It's harder. And it's a very weird.
You do seem to prefer when I'm like, okay, the tree is this one and the mummy is this one and stuff.
And they're
like
all
that.
bandits.
And they're all bandits.
One of them is literally a tree.
Yeah.
Yep.
And this one's the Pidgey, and this one's the army guy.
Yep. Absolutely. It works better for me.
So for you, I tend to use the even more different ones. Whereas like when running for larger PFS games or things like that, I'd be more likely to use like things that could ostensibly be bandits. Okay, these are humanoid bandits. I'm going to use like humanoid minis of some shape or form. I think I saw another question pop up.
There is another question that popped up. So the question that popped up is, how many encounters should the GM throw per day, from Rohit?
Depends upon the difficulty of the encounters.
It also just
as well as how much rest time the PCs have between.
It depends.
And the stakes you want to set.
Basically, there's no answer to this question because, like, some systems try to tell you how many encounters to do per day, and they're like those progress bars on computers that don't really know when it's going to be done, but they know that you would like to feel like you knew when it was going to be done, so they just vaguely underestimate it, and then they'll do it all at once when it finishes if they were wrong. And, like, I find, though, that when it's something like how many are in a day, and GM may actually beat themselves up over not using that amount, that it's actually harmful to give an amount that you're like, this is the standard amount.
I would say that, like,
it depends on the group, the difficulty, the resting time, what the encounters are like. Honestly, you can probably have almost an unlimited number of low threat encounters in a day. I mean, eventually you're going to need a 10-minute rest, or like in the remaster, a 30-minute superpower rest to get all of your focus points back. But and so that is somewhat of a limitation because there's only so many 10-minute increments that happen in a day. But certainly, compared to any number that you would have thought I was going to say, a number of encounters equal to the day divided by 10 minutes is probably higher than what I might have said.
Although from a pacing perspective, like, just like, you know, sleeping in real life is a chance to rest and refresh and like move on to a new day. You know, resting in a game is a chance to rest and refresh and like prepare new spells and like have some time to discuss things. So, you know, after a certain point, your players are probably going to want their characters to be able to cool off and process as well, and to have like a break in.
So I'd say no more than 50 encounters in a day.
And even one encounter in a day can be totally fine if it's a hard encounter,
or zero.
Zero. If you're trying to show that, like, you know, a particular area is safer, or like the PCs are approaching things from a more cautious perspective, you can totally have one encounter a day. I would say that, like,
or it's just a random encounter, and it may not even be that hard, or it might be severe. But the main thing is that a low threat encounter, basically, unless you're playing with a player style that, I don't know, like, you know, Magic the Gathering calls some players Timmy or Johnny or whatever. I just have called this player style Jane. I don't know a player named Jane.
Mm-hmm.
So the Jane player style that I've mentioned before is where it's like, okay, you're doing it. So you're level 17, you go into the dungeon and you see 5 goblins. Meteor Swarm! Are you sure, Jane? Meteor Swarm! Can we see if the fighter can... No, Meteor Swarm!
Mm-hmm.
You could delay on night, but Meteor Swarm. Okay, they're all dead.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a Jane player who's doing that, then you will probably be able to get through low threat encounters pretty much with only needing to occasionally take some 10-minute rests every once in a while, and you're not going to run out of daily resources. But there's not that many moderate encounters you can get through unless you have completely attrition-less classes in your party before you will likely hit the same thing, unless your party is either very low on attrition or very, very tactically good at combining themselves. The definition of a moderate is that it tends to tax some resources.
Yeah.
And severe, unless, like, that's the only encounter above low in the day is 2 severes, doing 2 severes with, like, any other significant stuff in it, it can be pretty rough. And certainly 3 severes in a day, a lot of parties can't do. However, what I'm saying here is for, like, an average party with an average matchup. If you're matched up against something that's like, oh yes, our party has many healing AoE clerics that also, these are undead that are just getting hit every time we're doing the healing for free, and if you're matched up against something you're good against, or the players are very tactical and they always outperform, or they're a group that are very good at continuing and doing more encounters in a day, this, even what I just said, won't be true.
I would say that to get a sense of what's good for your group when you're starting out and building into it, you know, one of the best number of encounters per day is the players choose. Like, you know, they're fighting a large dungeon and there's a lot of encounters, and you can get a sense of, like, all right, how far are they going to go before they rest? Where there's some time pressure, but not a ton. So it's like, all right, you know, you're probably going to be able to rest a few times while you're handling this particular situation, but, like, if you rest after every encounter, then the enemy's plots will advance. And then you can get a sense of, you know, how much does your group want to say, let's get through as much as possible in order to get as many rewards as possible and not give our foes any chance to move, versus how much does your group want to say, oh, you know, we're worried that this area is really dangerous, so let's, like, try to plan a reconnaissance and do, like, a few encounters and spend more resources.
Except for during the very lowest levels, most groups, assuming they get at least a 10-minute rest after, or a 30-minute power super rest in the remaster after each moderate or higher encounter, for sure. Maybe not every low needs it. Most groups should be able to do several moderates and then still have enough left to take on a severe. That being said, at level 1, sometimes a modern encounter can make you get wrecked, because in level 1, there's not a lot of, like, extra breathing room. So if it turns bad against you because of dice rolls, like, it can turn very bad against you.
And I think, too, like, the other things that factor into it, how much healing does your group have? How many consumables does your group have? Like, what kind of strategies did they usually take? You know, I would say it really depends. We can't necessarily say that people will spend, like, exactly this much resources, because every group is going to be different. But as long as they have some ability to rest and recuperate and retreat, and then those situations where they can't come later in the campaign, where you know your group and then can tailor a little better, or, like, have the ability to put something in there that gives an explanation for why they refresh some of their resources more than normal, even though they didn't get a chance to do a full rest.
That's right.
That's a tool that both of us have used. It's like, oh, this magical, awesome thing happened, and therefore you like got a rest at a mystical place or whatever, and you're back to full. Because we're like, all right, yeah, we want to keep the pace up really high, but like realistically, the PCs need their resources back.
Yep. So
also because like
sometimes you have to play it by ear.
Also, one thing that I find is that if you are if you have like an in-game day that spans over many sessions, it can get harder for the players over time to track like what they've spent and like make sure that they keep everything up to date. So the rest is also a chance to say, all right, you know, I no longer need to keep notes on exactly which spells I've cast and exactly how many hit points I'm at. Where we reset, we're back up to full, and we can handle what we're doing from here.
The problem with number of encounters and pacing is that is a much more difficult challenge than it seems, and so therefore I personally feel that a game master guide type book telling you how many to do is actually dangerous and is more likely to cause harm than good. It's literally more likely to cause harm than good.
It's more likely to mess you
up. Because let's take a look at one that some of you who've watched the show already know this little trick, which is, here's a question for you. So I was saying, you know, if you have to do a moderate or a severe, you should get to like probably do at least a 10-minute rest after that one before the next moderate or severe. Let's say that you did a low threat encounter and then immediately, like on the next turn after the low is defeated, a moderate comes into the room. Maybe even like at that very moment that you beat the last one, the moderates all come in, so you keep in the same initiative, and you're now fighting the moderate encounter. How difficult is that? In terms of the XP budget, you're going to get the XP for a severe plus encounter from that, because you get 60 plus 80 on 140 and severe is 120. But how hard is that encounter? How hard do you think that is in chat? Is it as hard as a severe plus, where all 140 XP of it was in the encounter at the very beginning? Is it as hard as a regular severe? On average, obviously, it'll depend on what you're throwing in. Rohit says a low, then immediately followed by moderate shouldn't even be severe.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a good instinct. It's definitely not a severe plus, because having all of them in there at the same time at the beginning would be a severe plus. It's clearly much easier.
And folks are talking about sort of like the action economy on the board and like the fact that you already have your buffs in play and stuff like that.
So this is very tricky because you don't know what classes they're playing and whether they have buffs. But assuming they might, it actually varies in difficulty from slightly harder than a moderate but easier than a severe on the hard end for like classes that don't have buffs, or they're like a psychic and they're gonna go into their withdrawal and symptoms of their main class feature after 2 rounds, and that's probably gonna hit them during the moderate and they're not very happy. Like, worst case, it's slightly harder than a moderate, but best case for the party, this low followed by the moderate is actually easier than just fighting a moderate encounter on its own.
Yeah.
This is a situation where you have decent enough defense, whether it's from like champions and shields and healing people or whatever, that you're not missing an appreciable number of hit points from the low, but that you put up some buffs, or even just actions like Inventor's Overdrive, or certain other actions that last
Barbarians and Rage
that last for a minute and that you don't have to do anymore because you put it up during the low threat encounter. But especially if you have like a haste or some other buff, it's just up for the moderate threat encounter already, and it may be actually easier than the encounter on its own. And the fact that it can go down from easier than a moderate encounter to harder than a moderate encounter, and even that easier than a moderate encounter is a possibility for what happens if a low goes into a moderate, is why it's so challenging to try to...
Rohit's talking about another element of this, which is battlefield control. If enemies come in at one at a time, encounters are generally easier. That's why wall spells are so good.
Yes, and if you have up a battlefield
control of the battlefield with a low threat, then again, those are actions that you don't need to spend during the moderate encounter, making the situation more favorable.
Yes, now at least the moderate encounter enemies will see where the things are ahead of time, and they might not be caught in the middle of it. But
it can still mess up their day by making the battlefield tactically harder to navigate.
Like if you're playing with Wood Eldamon, for example, and you've sowed a bunch of weird plants all over the battlefield that are messing the enemies up, and you're ready to harvest when the moderate encounter comes, that moderate encounter is not going to be happy. And normally you can't, because if you're outside of combat and you sow the plants, then you refresh like immediately and they go away. So there's a lot of situations where a low into moderate weirdly goes to value you don't think. And I don't think most people, when they hear that riddle, will ever at first instinct is it could be even easier than the moderate by itself. But
fighting more things makes it easier.
Fighting more things makes it easier. It's very weird. It's very idiosyncratic. It literally depends on what the enemies are, what the party is, and what the party decided to do. Because they may or may not cast haste during that encounter.
They may have decided that that the first encounter wasn't worth it to put those kinds of resources. But like if they know, for example, hey, we're storming the base of this opponent, and we're fighting these easier guards, but we're going to be working our way deeper into the complex. Then they can strategically plan. Let's get some of our buffs up sooner, and then just storm on through.
What matters is, did the PCs face attrition from the stage of the encounter they've done so far?
Yeah.
Or are they actually at an advantage because they have buffs or battlefield control or other things they put up that are still active for a time when the next stage comes in, right? And this is something that's not just true for tabletop RPGs either. It's the kind of thing where, like, if you play computer RPGs, sometimes there are ones where, like, you can't heal out of combat, but, like, in combat, healing doesn't cost any, like, resources or something like that. And so what you do in those CRPGs is sometimes you, like, cheese out the enemies until you kill all of them except one, and you just leave that one alive and heal your team up to full, so that you'll be ready for the next phase or the next thing that happens, the next wave of enemies that come in.
I wanted to reference something that Moonpie said before about running D&D games for kids. I think, and like maps and how they might be like stuck to the map. Thinking about kids and maps, one of my favorite experiences running games for kids was a run of kind of modified Weeby Goblins, where in the middle we're like, all right, you've reached a forest, and then I gave each of the kids different color markers, and we just had a conversation about like what's in the forest, and then they started drawing things that were in the forest. There were
unicorns in there.
There were unicorns. There were Minecraft statues. There was an old man who seemed grumpy but was actually really nice. There was all sorts of stuff. So like that was super fun for like just draw the place that we go into, and then we'll explore it.
Yep, absolutely. So, yeah, basically the answer to the question is it's complicated, and it's better not to assume that there is something, because whatever we wrote in that book, if we did, people would take it as, like, a gospel that angels, like, heralded on a trumpet, and any time that anybody did something different, it's like, you're doing it wrong, you had more encounters, you didn't have enough encounters, the only reason this didn't work is because your number of encounters wasn't this exact number of encounters, and, like, it's complicated. It's more complicated than just one value. Alright, so let's see.
Do we have any
I don't think so.
questions?
I think it was people guessing our little riddle and people saying the kids drawing idea is awesome. So, I think we've answered all of the questions. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube? Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye!